Okay, we begin in Washington, where President Donald Trump is uttering more threats against Canada and talking about who should run Canada.
U.S. President Donald Trump has announced a 25% tariff on all car and light truck imports into the country, saying the move would spur growth in the American economy.
The geopolitical dynamics of North America are undergoing a massive transformation. In a stunning turn of events, Canada, once seen as a stalwart ally of the United States, is now considering a radical shift in its international affiliations. For decades, Canada and the U.S. have shared a robust relationship, economically, militarily, and diplomatically. However, recent developments, particularly under President Donald Trump, have forced Canada to reassess its position on the global stage. A 2025 survey by Abacus Data revealed that 44% of Canadians now support the idea of joining the European Union. At first glance, this may sound far-fetched. After all, Canada is geographically distant from Europe, and the EU has traditionally been reserved for European nations. But the rise in Canadian support for this idea highlights just how serious the fallout from US policies has been. The trigger for this shift was the escalating trade tensions between the Trump administration and Canada. Trump's imposition of 50% tariffs on aluminum and steel imports from Canada and the 25% tax on electricity from Ontario marked a significant breakdown in their economic relationship. These measures were seen as punitive and highly damaging to Canadian industries, and they followed Trump's controversial statements suggesting that Canada's value to the U.S. was minimal. Trump's rhetoric crossed a line when he publicly stated that Canada should become the 51st state of the United States, implying that the country was a financial burden on the U.S., despite the critical economic and trade ties between the two. This rhetoric was compounded by a $200 billion yearly subsidy that Trump claimed the U.S. provided to maintain Canada's economy, a claim that was not only inaccurate, but deeply offensive to Canadians. In response to these provocations, Canada didn't just react with words, it strategically shifted its foreign policy. The Canadian government started to deepen its ties with the European Union in a variety of sectors, including trade, defense, and diplomacy. This pivot was also reflected in the growing public discourse and the increasing number of Canadians calling for an official break from U.S. influence. Social media exploded with campaigns urging Canada to leave America and join Europe, signaling a broader discontent that was beginning to permeate all levels of Canadian society. Now let's explore the legal and practical aspects of such a shift. Under Article 49 of the EU Treaty, only European countries are eligible to apply for EU membership. Geographically, Canada is not in Europe. So how could this ever happen? Interestingly, the term European country is not explicitly defined in EU treaties, which leaves a certain level of ambiguity. This lack of clear definition opens a potential loophole for Canada, much like how Cyprus, despite being geographically located in Western Asia, was accepted into the EU due to its historical, cultural, and political ties to Europe. The situation with Turkey is another precedent. Despite ongoing controversies, Turkey has remained an official candidate for EU membership due to its long-standing geopolitical ties with Europe. This precedent raises the question, could Canada, with its robust democratic system, economic strength, and strong NATO membership, eventually be welcomed into the EU despite geographical barriers? Now the question arises, what would it take for Canada to become a member of the European Union? On the surface, Canada seems like an ideal candidate. It is a longtime NATO ally, shares similar values with EU nations, and boasts a strong market economy. Additionally, Canada's bilingual nature, with both English and French as official languages, mirrors the diversity that the EU prides itself on. However, while Canada meets two of the three key Copenhagen criteria for EU membership, a democracy and a functioning market economy, the third criterion presents a major hurdle. The third requirement is for countries to demonstrate an ability to fully adopt EU laws and regulations. This would necessitate an overhaul of Canada's legal and regulatory systems, which would be both complex and costly. To comply with EU regulations, Canada would need to adjust its agricultural standards, tax structures, and even shift its currency from the Canadian dollar to the euro. Additionally, Canada would need to allow EU citizens freedom of movement within its borders, essentially opening up the country's immigration policies to European workers and residents. This represents a significant change to Canada's immigration framework, which currently prioritizes skilled workers, refugees, and family reunification. Perhaps the most significant challenge to full membership would be the potential reduction of the power of Canada's Supreme Court in certain areas, as EU membership requires countries to give the European Court of Justice precedence in legal matters. This would be a substantial compromise for Canada, a country that values its judicial independence. Full EU membership may prove too politically unfeasible due to these hurdles, but that doesn't mean Canada has no options. It could potentially explore alternative models that would align it closer to Europe without the full membership commitment. Given the challenges of full EU membership, Canada could instead adopt a model similar to other non-EU countries that have extensive ties with the European Union. Let's examine a few possible alternatives. The Norway model. Norway, although not an EU member, has access to the EU's single market and follows many of its laws. This model would allow Canada to integrate with the EU economically, without fully committing to political integration. The downside of this model is that Norway has no voting rights in EU decision-making, which limits its influence over key EU policies. Nevertheless, it offers significant economic benefits by allowing free trade and a high degree of alignment with EU regulations. The Switzerland model. Switzerland, similarly, is not an EU member, but it has developed hundreds of bilateral agreements with the EU. This model offers more flexibility than Norway's, but comes with a major drawback. The agreements require years of negotiations and are prone to delays and deadlock. Canada could choose this model, which would grant it preferential access to the European market, though it would require significant diplomatic effort to secure the necessary agreements. The post-Brexit UK model. Following the Brexit referendum, the UK no longer enjoys full EU membership, but has struck a Trade and Cooperation Agreement, TCA, that ensures continued cooperation in trade and defense. While this model grants the UK access to some of the benefits of EU membership, it does not afford the UK the full privileges of the EU single market. Canada could pursue a similar path, but would likely have to negotiate a similar agreement to ensure smooth trade relations with the EU. In any of these models, Canada could maintain a strong economic relationship with the EU, but would likely lose the full political influence that comes with membership. However, this is a trade-off that Canada might be willing to make, especially if the economic benefits outweigh the political sacrifices. Prime Minister Mark Carney has expressed a desire to elevate Canada's relationship with the EU to new heights. But if this happens, the ripple effects will be felt not only in economic terms, but also in the defense and geopolitical spheres. If Canada moves closer to the EU, it could signal a shift away from traditional US influence in favor of deeper engagement with Europe. This would mark a fundamental change in North American geopolitics, one that could have profound consequences for the United States. If Canada aligns more closely with Europe, the ramifications will be significant, not just economically, but also in terms of defense and global influence. Let's break down the potential fallout from this realignment and explore what it would mean for the U.S. economic impact. The first and most immediate consequence would be the economic impact on the U.S. If Canada moves closer to the EU, it could introduce trade barriers that would hurt U.S. businesses. This could lead to loss of access for American companies to the Canadian market, especially in sectors like automotive manufacturing, agriculture, and technology. With tariffs and trade barriers in place, U.S. companies would face higher costs and could potentially lose key markets in Canada. For instance, the automotive industry in the U.S. could experience significant setbacks, as Canadian manufacturers might shift their supply chains to Europe, or Canadian consumers might turn to European products, reducing demand for American-made vehicles. This would be a direct hit to American industries that rely heavily on Canadian exports. Defense and geopolitical impact. In addition to economic shifts, there would be defense implications. Canada's strategic location in the Arctic gives it significant importance in global defense strategy. If Canada aligns with the EU, it could lead to a weakening of US influence in the Arctic, allowing Europe to gain a stronger foothold in the region. This could undermine American power in an area that has become increasingly important as climate change opens up new shipping routes and resource exploration. Symbolic impact. Perhaps the most damaging consequence would be the symbolic blow to US global influence. If Canada, once considered the US's closest ally, chooses to align itself more closely with Europe than with Washington, it would send a powerful message to the world. This could create a deep fracture in the Western alliance, which has been the cornerstone of post-World War II global order. The US would lose a valuable ally and could face growing global skepticism about its leadership on the world stage. In recent weeks, President Donald Trump has intensified trade tensions by imposing significant tariffs on imports from key allies and adversaries alike. These actions have sent shockwaves through global markets and elicited sharp reactions from affected nations. On March 26, 2025, President Trump announced a 25% tariff on all imported vehicles, including cars and light trucks. This measure aims to bolster domestic manufacturing by discouraging foreign-made vehicles and encouraging production within the United States. However, the move has faced criticism and potential retaliatory measures from trading partners such as Canada, the European Union, and Japan. Concerns have been raised about increased vehicle prices and disrupted supply chains, which could adversely affect consumers and the automotive industry. In a related development, Senator Steve Daines, a staunch ally of President Trump, visited Beijing to lay the groundwork for a forthcoming summit between Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping. During his visit, Senator Daines met with Chinese Premier Li Qiang and emphasized the US's concerns regarding China's role in the fentanyl crisis. This diplomatic effort underscores the complexity of US-China relations, intertwining trade issues with critical public health concerns. The Chinese government has expressed strong objections to the US's linkage of fentanyl trafficking to trade policies. Chinese ambassador to the US, Xi Feng, criticized the US for using fentanyl as a pretext to impose tariffs, warning that this approach could transform a potential area of cooperation into a point of conflict. He emphasized the importance of constructive engagement and mutual respect in addressing complex issues like drug trafficking. These developments highlight the multifaceted nature of contemporary partners such as Canada, the European Union, and Japan. Concerns have been raised about increased vehicle prices and disrupted supply chains, which could adversely affect consumers and the automotive industry. In a related development, Senator Steve Daines, a staunch ally of President Trump, visited Beijing to lay the groundwork for a forthcoming summit between Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping. During his visit, Senator Daines met with Chinese Premier Li Qiang and emphasized the US's concerns regarding China's role in the fentanyl crisis. This diplomatic effort underscores the complexity of US-China relations, intertwining trade issues with critical public health concerns. The Chinese government has expressed strong objections to the US's linkage of fentanyl trafficking to trade policies. Chinese ambassador to the US, Xi Feng, criticized the US for using fentanyl as a pretext to impose tariffs, warning that this approach could transform a potential area of cooperation into a point of conflict. He emphasized the importance of constructive engagement and mutual respect in addressing complex issues like drug trafficking. These developments highlight the multifaceted nature of contemporary international relations, where trade policies, national security concerns, and public health issues are deeply interconnected. The actions taken by the Trump administration have not only strained relations with traditional allies, but have also complicated efforts to address global challenges collaboratively. In conclusion, the geopolitical shift we are witnessing between the US, Canada, and Mexico is reshaping North American relations. Canada's move towards the EU and Mexico's retaliatory measures are sending clear signals to the US. These developments could result in a major realignment of global power, challenging the status quo and threatening US economic and geopolitical dominance. As we move forward, we must ask, how far will these tensions escalate, And what will be the long-term consequences for global stability? Stay tuned for more updates as this complex situation unfolds.